Morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a session focused on a new Cold War, great power relations and competition in the 21st century. And we're pleased to welcome Dr. Michael McFaul as our speaker today. Let me say a few words of introduction to the topic before introducing Mike. In today's security environment, competition among the three major powers is, of course, a given. But it wasn't so very long ago that this wasn't the case. And for a very long time, the U.S. was reluctant to accept the fact of competition in a changing security environment. In 2007 and 2008, President Putin set out his vision of a deepening confrontation with the U.S.-led European order and U.S.-led global order, and which by that time had been the focus of rising concern and attention in Russian military and security elites for at least a decade. Yet through this period, the U.S. remained cautiously optimistic, seeking first strategic partnership with Russia, and then in the enterprise in which Mike and I were engaged, pulling out the reset button and hoping that we could make good on our cautious optimism. And there's a similar story vis-a-vis China. In the 1990s, following the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, China's leaders began to position China for a more adversarial relationship with the United States. And this culminated, of course, in President Xi's 2015 vision of the China dream, as it's called, of an Asia for Asians, quote unquote, and of a future world order with China, quote, in the dominant position at the center of the world stage. Yet through this period, America pursued cautious optimism again, hoping to persuade China to become a, quote, responsible stakeholder and offering strategic reassurances of various kinds. Then came Russia's military-backed annexation of Crimea, China's maritime assertiveness, along with revelations about the preparations of both countries for war with the United States and its allies, including nuclear war. Thus, the U.S. view shifted dramatically. My point isn't that we missed opportunities, it's that the competition did not start in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. My point is that competition has been underway for a while from the Russian and Chinese perspectives, and the U.S. has been reluctant to give up, to abandon its cautious optimism, and to accept that Russia and China had long since chosen the course of rivalry. For 7 years now, since roughly Russia's annexation of Crimea, we've been trying to find our bearings in this new competition as a nation so that we know how to compete and whether we're being successful in doing so. And for example, here at CGSR, we look back to the so-called competitive strategies of the 1980s for insights of contemporary relevance. National leaders have also looked to the arms race of the Cold War as a possible model for guiding our competition. In fact, there's a broadening national and international debate about the utility of the Cold War model in understanding the current era and in guiding U.S. actions. And in this broadening debate, our speaker today has posed a simple question. Is the Cold War analogy illuminating or distorting? And I look forward to his answer. Dr. Michael McFaul is a professor of international studies at Stanford University, where he also serves as director and senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He and I had the pleasure of serving together in the Obama administration. He served first as special assistant to the president, and then as senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council, and then moved on to an interesting tenure as a U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's the author of many books, including most recently a New York Times bestseller, From the Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Dr. McFaul has a bachelor's in international relations and Slavic languages and an MA in Soviet and East European studies from Stanford. And as a Rhodes Scholar, he completed his Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations at Oxford. Mike, thanks so much for making the time to join us today. Thanks for your leadership on these issues. Over to you for introductory remarks.
Well, thanks for having me, Brad. And you can hear me okay, right? Always want to check.
Hear you loud and clear.
Good. And I do have some slides, which I'll boot up right now. By way of introduction, this talk is based on a new book I'm writing. It's a book in progress. It is not completed, and therefore I welcome more now than 2 years from now feedback and suggestions for ways in which I could develop the argument. Let me see if I can get my slides to boot up, and I can see them. I want to make sure everybody else can.
Coming through clearly, yes.
Excellent. Okay. So it was a great setup, by the way, Brad. That's exactly the right way to frame the issue as far as I'm concerned. What I want to do today is just remind everybody, although now I can go through the first part a little bit faster, A, because of what Brad said, and B, because of the audience that I think I'm speaking to, although I can't see you. Spend a little bit of time on the causes of the Cold War, this new tension. Then do a bit of a deeper dive into the compare and contrast part with the actual Cold War. And I think that's important because some things I think are similar, some things are different, some things the United States did well during the Cold War that we should emulate today, and some things were disastrous in the Cold War that we should learn to avoid in the future. And that'll be kind of the substance of the talk. And then if we have time, and I'm looking at the clock, I want to make sure we get to questions. I have a few things to talk about in terms of prescriptions. So first, just to remind where we're at, yes, the Cold War analogy has been used repeatedly by both people that focus on U.S. Russia relations and U.S. China relations. It got going earlier, for those of you who are specialists on other parts of the world, as I look at this literature and look at the debate with respect to Russia. I remember very famously, I was at this meeting in 2016 when then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said, is it 2016 or 1962? Of course, he was referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But well before then, some were well ahead of themselves. Ed Lucas in particular, I think that book came out in 2008, A New Cold War with Russia. And it's on our side, Democrats and Republicans often use this analogy to talk about Russia. A few years later, you see the analogy pretty prominent, especially in the latter years of the Trump administration, with respect to are we in a new Cold War with China? And for Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, The Economist, the answer was definitively yes. I think this document was pretty important. I worked on a national security strategy. It was published in 2010 that I don't think anybody remembers. But I do think this one, and the principal author was H.R. McMaster and Nadia Shadlow when H.R. was a national security advisor. He's now a colleague of mine here at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. They I think rather analytically framed Russia and China as being the two great revisionist powers in the international system. And I think that will be remembered as an inflection point in how we deal with great power competition moving forward. So the first question, if we accept that that is true, the first obvious analytic question is, well, what the hell happened? Why did we go from this, the end of the Cold War, to this? That's a meeting in Los Cabos in 2012, and I was there. The meeting was a lot worse than that photo, or similar this in the last couple of years. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm happy with this particular audience to come back to this. I do think it's important to diagnose the problem first before we get to prescriptions. And in my view, I think we have a somewhat oversimplified debate going on, especially vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis Russia, where we just focus on the first factor here, independent variable in the language of political science. And I think that's wrong. I think you have to focus on all three of these factors to have a complete diagnosis for why we are at the place we are today. And let me pause here for 1 second just to state the obvious. I know quite a bit about Russia. I know a fair amount about American foreign policy. I haven't written about it and practiced it. I know a lot about the Cold War. I wrote my dissertation about Cold War competition between the Soviets and Americans in the developing world. I am not an expert on China. Let me say that one more time. I am not an expert on China. I have spent two of the last 5 summers in China before COVID. I've studied Marxist-Leninist regimes for most of my life. But that will be the black box as you see as I move forward in terms of talking about intentions of Xi Jinping and the CCP. But the very fact that I want to talk about intentions of that regime and their leaders is an analytic move that I'm making, which I think is important in terms of understanding great power competition in the 21st century. All three of these factors have to be part of the analysis. But today I'm going to talk about them rather superficially because I want to get to the compare and contrast part with the Cold War. First on power. To state the obvious, China is way more powerful today than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And that would create competitive reaction, no matter if we were a democracy, autocracy, no matter if China was as well. That I believe to be true. Power is where all analysis needs to start. Second, with respect to Russia, I think this is a little more controversial. I think Russia is actually a lot more powerful today than Russia was 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, literally almost, looking at the calendar. 2 weeks from now, it'll be 30 years to date. And that part, I think, is missed by a lot of our analytic community, and I think that's a mistake. I'll say more about that in a minute. And then relative power, the United States has decreased relatively vis-a-vis both China and Russia over the last 30 years. Although, in my view, as you're going to see in a minute, not nearly as much as a lot of analysts assume. Second, regimes. I do not think it's sufficient to end your analysis with a measurement of nuclear weapons, conventional soldiers, cybersecurity weapons of great powers. I think it matters what kinds of regimes govern these powers inside them. And here, just to recap the last 30 years, for me, there's been lots of continuity in the Chinese regime. It's a Leninist one-party dictatorship and always has been. It's much more repressive and much more autocratic today as a regime than it was 20 years ago. I think that's important to say. And I think that has implications for great power competition moving forward. But it was never a pluralistic system. It was never on a road to democratization. At least from my vantage points, that was never part of the agenda within China. And that's the way I see that regime. And that means there will be inherent structural tensions with that regime and the democratic world. And the United States is the most powerful democratic country in the world, no matter what politicians say and no matter what analysts say. I think that's an inherent structural piece of great power relations today. Russia is more complicated in that, in my analysis, Russia did move from autocracy to democracy in the late 80s and early 90s. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that that was a cooperative period between the United States and Russia. It was not just driven by asymmetric balances of power, although that was a driver as well. But Russia now has moved back towards autocracy under Vladimir Putin. And conversely, and I would say tragically, I don't think it's a spurious correlation that as Russia has become more autocratic, there has been more tension between Russia and the democratic world and more cooperation between Russia and the autocratic world, including just yesterday in response to President Biden's democracy summit. And then third, I think we need to be sober and pretty clear that the United States most certainly is a democracy, and I am not in the camp that thinks American democracy is on the verge of collapse. I'll say more about that in questions if you're interested. But we are most certainly a democracy in decline compared to 30 years ago. According to Freedom House, we're in a 10-year recession as a democratic system of government. Um, and you know, this weakening state capacity piece is an interesting dynamic that's related to democracy, but somewhat orthogonal to it. And I just think you put those all together, there's more tension as a result of these moments, and more of a moment of ideological competition as a result of continuity with China, Russia return to autocracy, and us fading somewhat, not as much as the more dire predictions in my view, but fading in terms of the faith we all had 30 years ago that democracy was the road that all countries were moving towards, and that it was the best system of government. And here, just to remind you, 10 years of democratic decline, 15 years of a global democratic recession. Again, this is Freedom House scoring, not my own. And then third, and this is the hardest factor and variable if we're talking in political science terms. It's the hardest one to measure, but I think that's not an excuse for ignoring it, which frequently happens in the social sciences. But I do believe that Xi Jinping himself has moved China in a particular direction that was not inevitable based on Chinese power or regime type, and that a different leader with the same regime type and same power might have moved China in a different, less confrontational direction vis-a-vis the outside world. And second, I believe that about Vladimir Putin. In fact, Vladimir Putin, we even have a bit of a test case. It was a short test case, but we had a different leader for about 4 years with President Medvedev, with the same regime type and the same, more or less the same power. And relations with the United States and the Western world actually were different. They weren't radically different, but they were marginally different. I think leaders matter. And I also think that leaders matter in terms of American foreign policy and the way that the United States deals with other great powers in the world. I think President Trump, had a profound impact on the way we dealt with Russia and China. And today, although it's early, you see some changes, but also some continuities with the new Biden administration. And just here to remind you of things that Putin did, I think all of those events are unique to Putin. I don't think they were inevitable because of some structural balance of power in the international system or because of autocracy. And likewise, again, with Xi Jinping, these are things that are unique to him. Not necessarily. India, of course, is not unique. South China Sea is not exactly unique. But the way that he has pursued foreign policy, given the regime type that he is the head of and the power that he has, I think you see a particular independent causal role for Xi as a leader today. And as I said, both of these leaders, not only in foreign policy, but also domestically, have moved their regimes in I would say, a qualitatively more autocratic direction compared to their predecessors. And then just in the international system and the way that we are perceived, leaders matter as well. And so this is the data from the Trump era. And now these are things that Trump himself did that were, again, in my view, not the result of either American power or the American political system, but were policy choices that he himself made. Now I realize I'm talking to people, I just realized I'm talking to people that are in the policy world, and this will seem really, really self-evident to you all. I would just note that in academia and in the study of international relations, the role of leaders is oftentimes completely dismissed. And so maybe this is self-evident to you. it might not be in a more a different kind of audience speaking about international relations. And then I do think this is important and a reflection of these other structural variables. It's not just Trump versus Biden, but there has been continuity, striking continuity with respect to China, less so with respect to Russia, although that's a moving target that maybe we can talk about in questions. But I see pretty striking continuity, maybe not with President Trump himself, but with the Trump administration, at least so far in terms of declaratory policy vis-a-vis China. You can read those. I think so. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, in terms of we can dig into the nuances of continuity versus differences. But I think that is the at 30,000 feet, that's how we got to where we're at. It's power, regimes, and leaders all together. Now, that gets me to the second part of the talk, which is the similarities and differences between the Cold War and U.S. Russia relations and U.S. China. And I want to just say at the outset that this is not black and white. In my opinion, those that say it's exactly like the Cold War are wrong, and those that say it has nothing to do with the Cold War are wrong as well. And if that is nuance that you are uncomfortable with, that's your problem, not mine. And I want to really underscore that preciseness about what is similar and different, and nuance is what I think is desperately needed in this debate about great power competition. And I think that's especially true for me about China. I think there's just too much black and whiteness in that debate. But I also think it's true about Russia. And so let me dig into that maybe for the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, first with Russia and the Soviet Union. This is a good news, bad news story in terms of continuity and change. So the good news, I'll do kind of a good news sing-song here, and I won't go through this whole list. You can just look at it and read it there. I don't know if you can see me in the right there. There I am with the vice president in his first meeting with then Prime Minister Putin. But let me just go through a couple of these, kind of good news, bad news. The good news with respect to power is we are not racing in an uncontrollable arms race with Russia in the same way that we did in the early part of the Cold War. That's good news. It's good news that we're moving in the opposite direction, and that I think it was good news that we negotiated the New START treaty, we got it ratified, and that President Putin and President Biden agreed to extend it. That's good news. The bad news is that we are now in a qualitative arms race. Again, people on this call, this talk are way more knowledgeable about these systems than I am, so I'm going to skip over it. But I would just say on both the offensive side and the defensive side, and then some rather creative new things like the Poseidon. This is new. It's different than the Cold War, and I think it's destabilizing and scary. So it's different, but it's not better with respect to the Cold War. Second, good news, bad news. The good news with respect to U.S.-Russia relations is that the ideological competition we had during the Cold War is over. The fight between communism and capitalism, which I think was central to the Cold War, and was not, as a result, was not very cold. It was a very hot war, and was the main driver of our competition with the Soviet Union. That has mostly ended in terms of the United States versus Russia. The bad news is in our current competition, there's a new ideological dimension that I think is not appreciated as much as it should be. And I would, describe it as Putin's orthodox conservative nationalism versus liberal internationalism. He would define it in different terms. But it is, in my opinion, at least from Putin's perspective, a very real competition. The first decade of his rule, he spent mostly consolidating power at home The second decade, he spent a lot of resources propagating these ideas abroad. And I think he's had some success, by the way. Finding allies in Salvini, Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, virtually every democracy in Europe, and I would include the United States. Canada has been, I don't think there's been much traction there. That's an interesting contrast with the United States. But in many countries throughout Europe, there are movements and ideological parties and leaders that lean more towards Putinism than they do liberal democracy. And this struggle, is somewhat different than the Cold War. The Cold War was largely a struggle between states, although not exactly. There were struggles within states as well. But this ideological battle is primarily taking place within countries and within democracies. That's new. It's a new ideology, and it has greater, I would say, greater force, those ideas do, than the last couple of decades of the Cold War. And that, I think, is a very big challenge for the United States. And then two more points. I'm going on longer but on this slide than I wanted. The good news from the end of the Cold War with the Soviets is that the instruments of competition, and especially proxy wars, have mostly ended. And again, just to remind everybody, the Cold War was not cold. Millions of people died. Koreans, Vietnamese, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Angolans, Zimbabweans, Americans, Russians. By some estimates, over 20 million people died during the Cold War. Thankfully, most of those that we have not yet returned to that either with the Russians or the Chinese. We have little pockets of it in places like Syria and Libya, but in the scale we had during the Cold War, the instruments of competition, that instrument is over. The bad news is that there's some new instruments of competition that were largely not part of the Cold War. So annexation, for instance, was not part of the Cold War. That's now back. Sanctions weren't part of the Cold War, a little bit, but now they're back. That's new, a much bigger part of how we deal with Russia today. Cyber weapons, obviously, that's something new. And assassinations, which on occasion happen, but that's a new element. If you just looked at the latest indictments, not indictments, conviction out of Germany just a couple of days ago, that's something new that we weren't dealing with during the Cold War. And then finally, this new one, which I'll get to in detail in a minute, a good piece for us, America, the United States. There was a Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War. That was good for us. Today, there's Sino-Russian cooperation, and I think it is naive to believe that we have the means to somehow build a wedge between Russia and China today. And that's bad news in terms of the moment that I called in my previous book, The Hot Piece. All right, this is the complex part. I'll come back to this later. I want to get to China and then some conclusions. So let me do the same thing with respect to China. We already talked about that. And again, I just want to be clear that I think the radical views in this debate, both of them are wrong. So, as Brad said, the old conventional wisdom that China was joining the liberal international order, I think, there's still some that believe that, but I think that camp, there are very few that are militantly there. But I have one foot that is there. I think to push to say that it is now preordained that China will not be part of the liberal international order and that we are back to Cold War 2.0, that's wrong. I think both camps in their extreme are wrong. And let me explain what I mean by that and then say a few things about prescriptions. All right, first, similarities. I'm just going to do the same exercise I just did with Russia with respect to my views on U.S.-China relations today. First, on things that are similar. One, I do think we're moving towards a bipolar world. We're not there yet, but it is more bipolar than it is multipolar. That reminds me of the Cold War, not the 19th century. Second, this competition between these two countries is global. With respect to economics and trade and investment, by the way, that's new. I'll come to that in the next slide. One could imagine two systems that didn't care about the rest of the world, two great powers that didn't care about the rest of the world. That is not the way it is today. That's similar to the Cold War, when our competition was global. Third, I believe there is an ideological competition between the United States and China today that reminds me, echoes, but is not the same, as you're going to see, with U.S.-Soviet relations today. It's democracy versus autocracy. It's state-led economic system versus a more free market system. And it is real. And I think, those that want to pretend that it doesn't matter, and if we could just all forget about ideology and forget about values, we could get along. That's not possible. I think it is a source of tension for both countries that will remain so as long as the two systems are differently organized internally. And then fourth, related to this, is that both systems, the American system way more aggressively so than the Chinese so far, but both US and China invest in propagating, and I use that word very, with some hesitation. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but are both supporting, how about that word, the more neutral word, ambassadorial word, our political ideas abroad, including having opinions about how other countries should be organized internally. And then the last thing that I predict tragically is that, like the Cold War, which lasted for 4 decades, I think the U.S.-China competition is here to stay for a long, long time. All right, but next to that, we need to also remember some really important differences. And in many ways, these differences, I think, are as important as the similarities. Why don't I just focus on 4 quickly, but we could go through this list maybe in questions. So first, I said, yes, it's a competition of ideology, but in my opinion, it doesn't have nearly the intensity of the ideological contest that we had during the actual Cold War. And here, I think we must be careful to not exaggerate the intention or the capacity. Intentions I can't measure because I'm not a China specialist, but I can look at capacity and I can look at results. And when I look at that, I see a radical difference between competition between the Chinese system of government and the American system today versus the ideological struggle in the Cold War. Both, I think, the Chinese intention is weaker. I think their capacity is weaker. And so far, their results have been a lot weaker in terms of Marxist-Leninist regimes appearing around the world. That's just not happening. And that's good news if you're an American or you're a small d Democrat that believes in democracy, comparing the Cold War versus today. Second difference is a little more complicated. The difference is easy. We all know it. We were not highly intertwined with respect to our economy and our societies being connected with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. What is harder to know is that good or bad? And I want to associate myself with the nuance position. I think to say that on the extreme that interdependence is good and it means that China will be constrained and eventually that will lead to them being a more responsible stakeholder, as Brad said in his introductory remarks, I don't believe that. I think that's naive. But I also believe the other extreme argument that we need to move to complete decoupling as a strategy for dealing with China's rise is also not prudent. And it's in part not prudent because I don't think it's an achievable goal. And the worst thing in terms of foreign policy, in my view, is to have a goal, have a objective that you're seeking that you cannot develop a strategy to obtain. And so that's my first objection to complete decoupling. But secondarily, and I think more importantly, I think that there are some places where we want more decoupling, and there are some places where we don't. That actually interdependence and connectivity and integration of our societies. And I teach at Stanford University, where we have lots of people with Chinese passports that work and teach here and that go to school here. That I think is a great thing for the United States and for science and for American national security. And therefore, I think here disentangling what is good about interdependence and what is bad is a hard challenge for U.S. China competition today, but cannot be resolved in a black and white way. And then two other things that are different, one that's good and one that's bad. Third, no proxy wars so far. I hope that we learn the lesson from the Cold War to not repeat that mistake. And I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we will, with respect to duking it out, like we did in Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. I do not think that will happen with respect to U.S.-China relations moving forward. But the bad news on our side is we are in a period of retrenchment now in the United States. It started with President Obama. It was sped up with President Trump. We are now at a different place with President Biden. And what I don't know is it an interregnum? Is Biden the last hurrah of the international presidents, or is it a pivot towards what I think is a more pragmatic strategy for the United States? But that variable that I can't tell you that makes me nervous, because if we are in a period of retrenchment where we don't engage, I think that could be very detrimental for American ability to compete with Russia and China in the 21st century. Okay, last thing I say, and I've gone on longer than I wanted because I went too deep in some of these slides. So maybe I'll skip over the prescriptive stuff. We can talk about that in detail in the questions, but just some lessons that are prescriptive, things to avoid on this slide, and then things to do, successes from the Cold War. First one, and this is a slide, by the way, this is a talk I give in China as well. This is not a talk I just give to Americans. And so I want you to think about that in terms of these lessons. First, I think really big, important lesson is to avoid threat misperceptions this time around. That, I think, got us into big messes during the last Cold War. And those are things we need to avoid in terms of competition, especially with China today. And the three big ones there, those are all things that we do not need to repeat in the 21st century. That fourth point is intended for Chinese audiences and for Russian audiences. I think a lesson for the Cold War for the Russians is that they were uncomfortable with evolutionary political change in systems in their sphere of influence at the time, and they overreacted to those. And I think that actually helped to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union in the long term. Second, overreach. This is related. We did a great deal of overreaching that was not necessary to prevail in the Cold War. We did not need to fight, in Angola, in my view, for instance, and support alleged freedom fighters in Angola to prevail in the Cold War. We did not need to fight the Vietnam War, in my view, in order to prevail in the Cold War. And those are, I think, very important lessons for our current competition, again, especially with China. And here, the debate between Kennan and Acheson at the beginning of the Cold War about whether you need to contain communism everywhere or have a more moderate view of that view. That was Kennan's view, to be more moderate. Acheson and others, NSC 68, we had to stop communism everywhere. I lean heavily in this debate with respect to China in the Kennan School. We need to define our vital national interests and then be very clear about them in places like Taiwan. But Huawei and Rwanda, I don't think we have a vital national interest to stop Huawei and Rwanda, and I don't want us to waste a lot of resources doing so. I'll come back to that, I'll bet, in questions. Third, I just want to remind you that, as part of fighting the Cold War, we embraced a lot of horrible people, and we called them our allies, and we pretended they were moving towards democracy. I think that's a good lesson to avoid in the Cold War. And then this fourth point, I published a book about the collapse of the Soviet Union a long time ago, 2001. It was translated in Chinese, and it has now sold way more copies in China than it has in the United States, tragically, because the Chinese really want to study Gorbachev and what happened there, and to avoid the mistakes of Gorbachev. And I think that's very wise on their part. But they really need to study Brezhnev and the period that the Russians called Zastoy. In my opinion, the parallels between the Brezhnev era and the Xi Jinping era are a lot greater than any comparison to Gorbachev today. And that is a lesson, I think, for Chinese leaders. All right, I think I'll end on this slide. Brad, I'll just go through the rest of them really quickly to give you a flavor. But good lessons to emulate today. And here, you can just read this. I just think they're pretty self-evident. But we learned after the Cuban Missile Crisis to cooperate and confront simultaneously. We got to do that again with the Chinese. And here's just some examples of things we did that were cooperative. We've got to do that with the Chinese today. And we have to learn those habits. And I'm nervous, especially on the China side, that they don't have the ability to disaggregate cooperation from confrontation and to avoid linking issues that shouldn't be linked, in my view. It took us a while to learn those habits. We've got to do that again. And then second, especially after 1962, we developed mechanisms to reduce misperceptions and misunderstandings. We need to do that again with both Moscow and Beijing. There is not enough connectivity. There is not enough of these kinds of mechanisms in place. It makes me nervous that we are not engaging and talking more, and at not just heads of state levels, but lower levels as well. Here, I'm going to skip this because I've already talked about it, and just end by, I'm going to skip all this because this expert group knows this stuff. This is just my assessment of power, and just get to, happy to send you these slides. This is stuff this crowd will know. Just confirming the earlier part. I want to end with this. I am nervous about America's role in the world today. I want to be clear about that. Partly and mostly, I would say, because of what's happening within the United States, both our debate about democracy, and that we're debating democracy, by the way, that scares me to death, and our debate about our engagement in the world. And I don't want to pretend that I know where we go from this current moment. But I do want to remind you that the rise of other powers and moments when it felt like the democratic world was about to end, that's a movie and a tragic history we've seen before. This was the most obvious one during the 1930s. I think we got down to 12 democracies then. But we know now that democracy and the liberal, the liberal world did not end then. That's the map of the world in 1930, pretty bleak map. Likewise, we had another moment when it felt like the world was becoming red with the fall of, with the seizure of power of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. We had a big debate about whether this is the end of democracy, and then it became accentuated and even scarier 2 decades later, when it really looked like communism was on the march. Correlation of forces is the phrase that the Soviets used. And I would remind you that this was a time also when we were experiencing tremendous turmoil here within the United States in terms of political polarization, dealing with injustices that had not been resolved for decades. Punctuated at the end of this period by the resignation of our president. We did not look like we were a thriving democracy in the late 60s and early 70s. At the same time that communism was on the march in Indochina, Southern Africa, parts of Latin America. And yet, just 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And even for my book, I've gone back and looked at this debate. Pretty interesting what people were writing in the 80s about China's rise and great power competition, which now looks like an overreaction to a threat that never materialized in the 80s. And so I don't want to pretend I know where we're going, but I want to caution you as we think about the challenge of dealing primarily with China, but with Russia as part of the autocratic great powers that we're dealing with, that I think it would be premature to know that we could predict with certainty about American decline. And with that, I went on 10 minutes longer than I wanted, Brad, but I'm going to stop now. Thank you for your patience for listening.